All right, here we go again. This is our fourth video, and this one is on research methods. This is also planned to be part of week 1. And I am really committed to keeping this under 15 minutes again. We'll see if I can do it. So here we are talking about research methods, particularly as they relate to lifespan development research. So developmental research, in this case, we're really looking at social sciences, we're looking at psychology research, and we'll also pay a special attention to how to research things for people who are at certain ages or who we may also be talking about the same people as they age, and how do we research them. But let's just stop for a minute and talk about what a scientific theory is, because this is all supposed to be rooted in science. And a scientific theory is an explanation for why things are the way they are. It explains something. A theory can't be proven, because if it was proven, it would be a fact, not a theory. So typically, theories are never fully proven, and they're often just refined. But in order for a theory to be scientific, it has to be falsifiable. You need to be able to test it in such a way that it could be proven false. Theories can't be proven true, but they need to be able to be proven false. Otherwise, it's just belief. So you can. So there's that. So the way that you would prove a theory false, you would try to falsify a theory in the scientific method. And if if a theory isn't falsified, then you get to keep working on it. But the whole game within science is you put forth a theory and then you attack the heck out of it to see if you can break it. And if it doesn't break, then your theory's doing pretty good, and you can continue to work with it to use it to explain phenomena. An elegant theory is something that explains a wide swath of phenomena with just a few propositions. Evolution is an elegant theory. It sort of rides on the idea of the survival of the fittest, and it explains a whole heck of a lot of things that we observe in the living world, different species of plants and animals, etc. So an example of a theory in development would be, I picked attachment. When infants are securely attached to a caregiver, they develop a sense that the world is a good place and that they are safe and valuable in it. So that's sort of attachment explains a sort of a sense of worth, a sense of value, a sense of safety that would then develop later. And then what we're going to see is that if we wanted to really test that, we could then form hypotheses to actually go into the world and collect data and see if certain things would hold true. So a hypothesis is a testable prediction of what will be observed prior to collecting or analyzing data. So a hypothesis, at least in the scientific process, because the word is used in different realms, but in science, a hypothesis is, hey, I'm about to go investigate something, and I'm going to form a hypothesis about what I think I will find based on a theory. So an example here is, if secure attachment is related to positive development, as suggested by the theory that we just looked at, we expect adolescents who were securely attached as infants to be less likely to drop out of school. That would be just one instance of, if this were true, if this theory were true, then we would expect to find and observe this out in the world. So the hypothesis is used to test a theory by predicting the relationships and effects that will be observed in specific data that is collected and analyzed. That's how we use the term hypothesis in science. So with that, then there are different types of data collection. And what I thought, and you can read more about, and you have read more about them in the book, but I sort of wanted to focus in on What are some of the advantages of different types of data collection? So if you're going to observe behavior in a lab, what's good about that is you can really control the variables that might affect the outcome of the variables versus controlling, observing behavior out in the world. So like, let's say we wanted to watch mother-child interaction and they're out at the mall and suddenly a friend drops by, right? Or there's now music, or, Barney is, or Santa, I don't know. I can't think of, I should have thought this out, but I didn't. But like things can happen out in the world that could get in the way of your making a very specific observation. In the lab, you can set things up. You can say, here, compare how much is in this glass of water to how much is in this glass of water. And you can really focus that child's attention, or you can really focus in on how the child reacts to the mother when she leaves the room and comes back. That's actually an experiment associated with attachment. So the advantage in a laboratory is that you can control the variables, but the advantage in naturalistic observation is there's no distortion. You're not distorted by the expectations of the lab. So within the research, somebody comes in and now they're waiting in the waiting room and they're filling out their forms, and they go in the lab and maybe the room is painted yellow and there's a window, a mirrored window, and you get the sense that you're watching you. So those kinds of things could impact the natural way that you behave. And so then what you're observing may not be the true phenomenon that you're interested in, but something that's been distorted by the weirdness of the lab. If you're out in the world, you're just watching the true phenomenon. So for example, let's say we wanted to observe whether, a parent is warm with their children. Now, they could come into the lab and put on a big show about how warm they are. But if we put a video in their house and let it run for 2 weeks, they're going to forget the video camera's there, and they're going to behave naturally with their child. And then we could potentially observe whether or not that parent is really warm with their children. A case study allows researchers to go into more detail about a particular phenomenon in one case. So you can get really rich in what you're describing. Often case studies are used. How are they used in development? I often think of them in business school. Case studies are always used, like you look at a business, you see what it did, you see the effects that it had, and very rarely can you put a research. Anyway, a case study is all about being specific. Or let's say you have a child with autism, and you really want to understand whether that, what are the ins and outs and the experiences associated with autism. And so instead of forming your theory with, often you want to do a case study and look really in depth at one thing before you form a theory, so you can start to get a feel of what's really going on in these cases. So physiological measures, the advantage there is that it's not distorted by the image the participant wants to present. So like if you're measuring my heartbeat, you can tell that something's happening to me. I mean, you don't necessarily know whether I'm excited or afraid, but you know that something about my physiology changes. You can also watch my brain regions work. You can see whether my frontal activity is activated. If it's activated on the right-hand side, you can see based on prior research that might be a negative emotion, actually, whereas left activation may be a positive emotion. So you can see these things happening, and the fact of the matter is that I can't control it. I can't tell, if I'm going to tell you, well, how to answer the question, how do you feel right now? And I say, I feel good, but my right activation, I could easily, so physiological measures don't lie the way that human beings do. Surveys allow researchers to ask a very large number of people about something in a systematic way. So a survey usually has a structure, and every person who is asked in exactly the same way. Often surveys may even have sort of ratings and measurements. So now you can collect quantitative data and you can analyze quantitative data in a very specific way. So one of the big advantages about surveys is you can ask many people systematically about a phenomenon. An interview is advantageous in that the research can ask a few people in a fluid and probing way. So you're asking your question, and the answer's interesting. And you can ask your interviewee, well, tell me more about that. Or, oh, that's different than what you said 2 questions ago. And you can start to probe and maybe get at information about a phenomenon in a much detailed way. In fact, I think that case study and interviews go hand in hand, because you're dealing less with the attempt to find out general information about many people all at once, and more about really digging deep into somebody's experience. Okay, here I am really taking too much time on everything, and I apologize again. Research design, the 3 basic types are descriptive research, which aims to observe and record behavior. It doesn't allow for predicting behavior. It doesn't allow for explaining behavior. You can just look at it and say, this is what happened. Correlational research looks for a systematic relationship between phenomenon. It does allow you to predict behavior. If you, for example, if there's a relationship between studying 5 nights a week, the more you study each night, the more nights a week you study, the higher your grades will be. You can predict. You can ask somebody, how many nights a week do you study? And they say, well, 5. You can predict a high grade, if there is such a relationship. I actually don't know that there is such a relationship, but we can talk more about that as we work together. Experimental research is looking for whether one phenomenon causes another phenomenon. So what that is I'm going to manipulate the level of hours that you study, or and nights a week that you study. I'm going to assign you to the treatment group, where you all are set to study 5 nights a week, and then I'm going to test your grades. And at the end of the semester, I'm going to expect the 5 nights a week group to have higher grades than the control group, where it wasn't manipulated at all. Right? The control group means that the variable wasn't manipulated. When you have this type of design, it allows you to say, aha, studying caused the higher grades, because the students were randomly assigned to each one of these groups. One wasn't manipulated, nothing was done to change their behavior in any way, and the other one was shaped, manipulated, so that they studied 5 nights a week. And voila, if the grades increased, then you can say that studying every night of the week increases grades. All right, here's a little bit about correlation. I wanted to be able to really emphasize to you that correlation is, this is the correlation coefficient. The correlation coefficient is R. It's always written as R. You don't really need to know that for the purposes of this class, but you might encounter it in your life, so I want you to know it. And correlations can either be no relationship at all. For example, here you have shoe size is not correlated with intelligence. So each one of these dots is an instance. So in this case, the person has small feet and low intelligence. In this case, the person has large feet and low intelligence. And what you see here is that there's really no relationship between shoe size and intelligence. So the level of one thing going up or down has no effect on whether the levels of another thing goes up or down. In a positive correlation, this one is as one thing goes up, the level of the other thing goes up. So here we have maternal smoking is positively correlated with fetal defects. So here's somebody who doesn't smoke at all, and there's almost no fetal defects. There's still 1 or 2. And then as the maternal smoking goes up, now here's somebody smoking 7 cigarettes a day. Is that a lot? I don't even know. And the likelihood that their child will have their developing child will have a defect goes up as the level of smoking goes up. See? So that's a positive correlation. Here, this would be written as R equals 0.80. If R equals 0.1, it would be a perfectly right down the middle. So when this one cigarette goes up, the fetal defect goes up. But here it's not exactly a perfect correlation. The negative correlation, and this sometimes can be confusion because you think a negative sometimes people confuse the negative correlation with no correlation. But here, a negative correlation indicates that there is a relationship. Exam scores are negatively correlated with class absences. So the more that you miss class, the lower your exam score is. So a negative correlation, negative 0.80, is a really strong negative correlation between exam scores and class absences. Okay, here I am over time again, but now here's a picture of an experiment. A well-done experiment does imply causation. And in this case, you manipulate the variable in one group without manipulating the same variable in a control group and compare the subsequent level of an outcome variable in both groups. So this example is, my hypothesis is that time constraints will increase frustration level. I'm going to assign randomly, that's important, people to the experimental group, where I tell them to solve a puzzle in no more than 3 minutes. And the control group, where I tell them to solve the puzzle taking as much time as they want. Then I'm going to measure their frustration level, and I'm going to compare the average frustration group level from this group to this group. And if the experimental group has a higher frustration level than the control group, then I get to say time constraints caused higher frustration. That's the basis of an experiment. Now you know. There are many different types of experiments and many different ways to think about it, but knowing that that's the basis of an experiment, we're talking a lot about it in COVID-19 times, about the need to have a control group in order to really know whether something has an effect on something else. You know, now when you hear people talk about that, hopefully this view of what an experiment will help you with that. I also want to talk to you about cross-sectional design. This is when we want to compare people of different ages. And if we want to do it cross-sectionally, it means that we go in and we grab the data all at once, at one time, and we're looking at people of different ages. So at one time, I may look to see, I guess it's not that often that you're going to compare an infant to an old lady, but sometimes it happens, where you would compare, let's say, happiness levels between young children, teenagers, adults, and old people. So then next Tuesday, I go out and I ask a whole swath of people, how happy are you? I come back, I look at the data, and I compare the age groups, right? And that might tell me, and let's say that I see that let me just say that I may see that young children say that they're happiest. No, I don't want to do that. I'm sorry if I'm confusing you. So what can happen? And then this is what I'm building up to. So I may find that, let's just say that I may find that adults are old people are happiest. And that's all well and good. But I may get to just describe the fact that old people are happier than people who are younger than them. But I don't get to say that getting old causes greater happiness. because I haven't watched the same people change over time. If I wanted to watch the same people change over time, I would measure happiness in tiny children in 1940 and then go back 6 years later and measure their happiness and go back and go back and go back and go back. And I would collect data multiple times on the same people, and I would see whether their level of happiness changed. And if I found that their level of happiness increased, I could use that along with this, and it would help me to really say that getting older actually increases happiness. But one of the reasons why this one, I can't quite come to that conclusion if I just collect everybody's data all at once, is because there may be a cohort effect. A cohort effect is when people who are the same age experience a historical event like 9/11 or the advent of mobile phones and are thus impacted in a certain way. So there may be a cohort effect for Granny and Grandpa here because they don't use mobile phones and therefore they're happier because they never had to deal with Facebook. They just didn't bother, say. And so therefore they're happier. There could be a cohort effect. That's why if we really want to understand the effects of aging, we need to do longitudinal research. Lastly, I'm just going to mention there are a couple of ethics involved with research. It's important that when we do research on humans, that they are informed about what they're doing enough that they can provide consent to participate in this enterprise. They also need to be voluntary at all times, and that at any point they can decide to quit. We can't be lying. There's some cases where we could lie to them, but if we do, it's important that when we lie to participants that we debrief them, there's this understanding that we owe our participants the truth, and that we keep their data, their responses, or our observations about them confidential. And lastly, there's this idea of minimizing bias, and that's an important aspect of research. And now this chart here, it identifies there are different types of biases, and some of them can invalidate your research. So in this case, a researcher may unintentionally try to make their research come out as they expected. They think this drug is going to work, so then they may treat the people who are getting the drug in a different way, and therefore generate an outcome for that drug and not even know they did it. That's why they have double-blind studies, so that people administering, say, the experimental treatment are blind to the expectations of the outcome. Another problem is that researchers may only focus on their own culture. And so there's so much research about white men, and that's good. And we need more research, and we need to recognize that there's a limitation. So for like there are big problems in that we saw even when we were looking at the theories. You saw Freud's idea about psychosexual development, and he's naming the phase in early childhood the phallic stage. That's just a pretty male-centric perspective. Also in drug studies, when you study the effects of a drug on men and men alone, you're not going to really understand whether that drug is going to affect women and what the dosages should be. So, and in social science, there's way more reason to include all genders, and increasingly in our day and age, we're probably going to have to do better at understanding different gender orientations as well. So, the answer to this is diversity, so that we're getting a better understanding of effects of different types of people and getting out of our own cultures and getting more diverse samples. Also, here is this problem that some characteristics of a sample may be skewed. For example, people who sign up to take yoga may be already predisposed to relaxation. So if your outcome measure is relaxation and all you do are measuring people who attend yoga to people who don't attend yoga, you're not necessarily going to find an example of whether yoga causes relaxation, because people who volunteer to take yoga may be already more likely to relax. So the only way that you can do that is to do random assignment. You also need to make sure that you have representative sample, that people that are representative of a diverse enough group. And then the last thing is that I'll talk about today is the problem that some participants may not want to tell the truth, or they may want to help researchers, or they may want to damage the researchers' tests. So they may behave in different ways. Like let's say you wanted to ask people about their sexual activity or adolescents at school about their drug use. They may not want to tell the truth, especially if they think that their anonymity or confidentiality won't be protected. Another way to get around this is to give some people placebos. And also this would be a case where you may want to have a temporary deception, where you might not tell them at the beginning of the research all the details about what it is you're studying, so that they don't try to help you or try to hurt you. Instead, you just give them enough where they can make an informed consent, and then tell them at the end what was going on. Okay, that's the lecture. 26 minutes. I'll keep trying. Thank you, friends, and we will see you soon.